I don't remember much about the ride home, just that the cab smelled faintly of peppermint and vinyl, and that the air outside the window looked flatter than usual, as if the world hadn't quite resumed its depth. The painkillers were still, fogging the edges of my thoughts, leaving me somewhere between sleep and waking. But I remember feeling relieved to be nearing our house. I imagined the kettle already on. Maybe Eric would have fluffed the cushions on the couch, folded the blue throw blanket I liked over the arm. A bowl of soup, something warm, the smell of garlic or thyme drifting from the kitchen. I hadn't told them I was coming home early. Was a spontaneous decision, made more from weariness than logic. The hospital had cleared me. I just wanted to be in my own bed. But when the car pulled up, something felt wrong. Not loud or obvious, but quiet in a way that scratched at my senses. The front step was bare. No package deliveries, no shoes kicked off near the door, no signs of movement behind the windows. The curtains were drawn tightly, like a house. In morning, I rang the bell once, and again, nothing. I tried the handle, thinking maybe someone forgot to unlock it. It was stiff. Secured from the inside, I called Eric's phone. It rang twice, then went silent. I checked the time, just past 7, not late. Not the kind of hour where people were unreachable. I called again, then Marla, then the landline, still. Nothing. I sat down slowly on the top step, the motion stiff and awkward, my body still stitched and slow. The anesthesia made everything feel half submerged, like I was watching myself from underwater. A part of me thought maybe I'd gotten the dates wrong. Maybe they hadn't expected me until tomorrow. Across the street, Mrs. Lynn was watering her hedges. She gave me a quick wave, then paused mid-motion, tilting her head slightly, like she was trying to place something that didn't fit. I almost asked her something, anything, but the words got caught behind the sour taste in my throat. My phone buzzed. A promotional text? Nothing from Eric. I wrapped my arms around myself, more out of habit than warmth. The evening air had grown sharp, brushing against my skin like cold breath. I started noticing little things, like the garbage bins were missing. Ours were always lined up neatly on Tuesdays. Now there were just faint tire tracks, a smudge of something oily on the curb. I told myself to wait, that someone would pull up any moment, that they had just stepped out briefly. But time stretched long and thin, the kind of time that makes you realize how much space silence can take up. I texted Eric again. I'm home. Where are you? Delivered. Read. No response. At some point the porch light flickered on. Motion sensor. Probably. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there. My legs had started to ache, the bandages around my side pulling tight with every slight movement. I could have called a friend. I could have called a cab back to the hospital. But I didn't. I sat there, surrounded by my own thoughts, letting them fill in the empty spaces where voices should have been. It wasn't just the locked door that hurt. It was the deliberate silence. The stillness that felt less like an accident and more like a decision. It's like someone had paused the record of my life and stepped away, uninterested in pressing play again. Eventually, I curled up on the bench beside the door and closed my eyes. Not to sleep, just to disappear for a while, and somewhere in that long stretch of quiet, as the streetlights buzzed above me and the world refused to shift, I stopped wondering when they would come home. I started wondering if they'd ever planned for me to come back at all. It didn't feel sinister, not at first. It felt like kindness. That's how it always begins. I think the small things wrapped in silk, offered with soft voices and gentle hands. Marla had shown up the day before my surgery with a grocery bag full of bone broth and lip balm, saying she'd cleared the guest room for me. She used the word sanctuary, said Eric would be too distracted, too busy juggling work and the house. Let me take care of her just for a week. Eric hadn't hesitated. He nodded like it made sense. It was easier this way. I remember watching the two of them from my place on the couch, how they communicated in short, silent looks, like an understanding passed between them that I hadn't earned. I told myself not to overthink it. Pain does strange things too. Perception, they packed an overnight bag for me. Just the basics. Marla said pajamas, phone charger, my white sweater. I reached for my larger tote, but she touched my wrist and said, "You won't need all that. We'll take care of everything at home." They kissed me on the forehead, helped me into the car, and promised I'd be back before I even missed the smell of my own sheets. Marla's guest room was tidy, floral, and faintly impersonal. The kind of space that feels like a hotel made by someone who thinks softness is the same as warmth. A beige throw, a basket of curated snacks, scented candle I never lit. At first I was grateful. She brought me warm tea in the mornings, folded my laundry before I even noticed it needed folding. Her kindness was so efficient, so polished, that it began to feel like performance. Nothing ever seemed out of place. But somehow I always felt like I was. I started noticing little things, like how my phone was never quite where I left it. Once I found it on the kitchen counter, even though I remembered leaving it beside the bed. Marla laughed when I asked and said something about painkillers messing with my memory. She wasn't cruel. That's the thing. She never raised her voice, never said anything that could be quoted back as harmful. But there was a tightness in her smile when I asked too many questions. A flicker of something behind her eyes when I offered to call Eric myself. Her husband, Ron, hovered more than I liked, always making small talk about finances, downsizing, how hard it was for people our age to get ahead, how lucky Eric and I were to have no kids, no major attachments. One afternoon I heard him say, "It's just stuff. People get so emotional about things that don't matter in the long run." I didn't respond. My head ached too much. But the way he said people, the way his voice curled around it, made me feel like a category. Eric called once, maybe twice. Each time his voice was brisk, polite, checking in. "Marla says you're doing great." He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't ask if I wanted to come home. He said they were handling things, that I should focus on healing. I didn't argue. I didn't even know what to argue for exactly. On the third day, I asked Marla if I could stop by the house just to grab my sketchbook. I hadn't drawn in days, and the quiet was beginning to gnaw at me. She paused just a beat too long, then smiled and said, "Oh, I think Eric packed most of your things already." Packed, already. The word landed strange. It's like a piece of furniture moved just enough to make you trip over it. I didn't press. Told myself there was no reason to. I wasn't thinking clearly, still drugged and vulnerable. That was what I told myself. But later, in the silence of the guest room, I found myself staring at my phone, scrolling through old photos of our living room, our bookshelf, the tiny crack in the hallway wall that Eric kept meaning to fix. I couldn't explain the feeling that something was slipping just out of frame. Marla knocked gently on the door and brought me more tea, chamomile with honey. She asked if I was comfortable, and I nodded, even though I wasn't single quotes. Her kindness was absolute, but it had the weight of something being managed. And Eric had stopped feeling like someone who forgot to call. He felt more like someone who had chosen not to. There's a difference between forgetting and knowing something's gone. The kind of knowing that lives in your hands, not just your head, the absent weight of a locket, the space where velvet should brush against your fingertips. That was how I noticed the necklace first. A small gold oval with a hairline crack. Down the middle, my grandmother's. I used to run my thumb along it when I felt anxious. It had always lived on the tray beside my mirror, right next to a chipped porcelain ring dish. I remember seeing it the week before my surgery, shining faintly in the dusk like a quiet promise. But 2 days later, it was gone. Not misplaced, not moved, just gone. I asked Eric, casually, watching his face. He blinked, scratched the side of his neck, said maybe it had fallen behind the dresser. But he didn't check, didn't even stand up. Just sat there with that same tired half smile. he wore whenever he wanted to make something go away without discussing it. I told myself it wasn't worth pushing, that it would turn up, that I was tired. Then it was the teacups, a boxed set I'd inherited from my aunt, tucked high on a kitchen shelf. I wasn't sentimental about much, but those always felt like an anchor to a quieter time, delicate. China with pale blue vines, packed so carefully in yellow tissue. I hadn't looked at them in months, but one afternoon, in a strange urge to hold something familiar, I pulled the step stool out to find them. The shelf was empty. Marla was standing nearby, drying her hands on a dish towel. She said maybe I'd moved them, or maybe we'd donated them when we cleared out the hall closet. Wasn't that months ago? I didn't remember donating anything. But her tone made it sound like I should. I asked Eric later, low and quiet. While brushing my teeth, he mumbled something about decluttering. Said we were always talking about it, then changed the subject. It was the way he said we, as if he and I had agreed, as if I'd been present. I started walking through rooms differently after that, noticing things with an invisible checklist in my head. The photos on the hallway table were fewer. The green vase I used for eucalyptus branches had disappeared from the windowsill. The music box with the ballerina I kept in the linen closet was missing, though the indent in the dust where it had sat remained like a memory carved in silence. I didn't say anything. Not right away. I didn't want to be that person, paranoid, grasping. It's grasping. I'd been tired, and the lead up to the surgery had left everything muddled. I kept convincing myself it was stress or fatigue or some quiet slippage in time, until one night I heard them whispering in the kitchen. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I was heading down for a glass of water, feet bare against the cool wood floor. But I stopped at the landing when I heard my name in Marla's voice. She said we needed to be clear about storage, that it couldn't drag out, that it was better to split things cleanly. Eric didn't say much, just murmured something low. I heard her say again, firmly this time, she won't even notice half of it's gone. I remember backing up the stairs slowly, one hand on the rail, the other pressed flat against my chest. My heartbeat felt strange, not fast exactly, just off rhythm. Like something in me was stepping out of sync. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the paint that hadn't been there before. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask who he was, or what exactly they were planning to store or split or vanish next. Instead, I started keeping a notebook. Small things, missing things, words that didn't sound quite right. I wrote them down in the early hours when the house was still and no one was pretending. Because pretending, I was starting to learn, could be very gentle and very thorough. The quiet after surgery isn't like normal quiet. It's heavier, padded with the slow drip of recovery, full of vague aches and time that folds in on itself. You notice sounds more, the ticking of clocks, the hum of the fridge, the way the curtains shift even when the window is closed. It was in that kind of stillness that I picked up the phone to call home. Not my cell, the landline. The one we rarely used but kept on the kitchen wall for emergencies, for old-fashioned habits. I knew the sound of its ring by heart, a flat, honest tone. I wanted to hear it ring. I wanted something ordinary, but instead there was nothing. No ring, no static, just silence. I tried again, same result. Then again? It was as if the number had been plucked from existence. I sat there for a moment, phone still warm in my hand, trying to decide what that meant. I told myself maybe the line was down. Maybe there was a billing issue. Didn't have to mean anything. But that's the thing about silence. When you're already on edge, it's never neutral. It becomes a question you can't stop asking. I sent Eric a message. Can you bring me my blue sweater? It's the one from the hall closet. It was cold in Marla's guest room. Too cold for chamomile and politeness. Hours passed. I drifted in and out of light sleep. The kind that doesn't rest you, just suspends you. When his reply finally came, it was short. We packed it. Not I. Can't find it, or it's at home, or even I'll bring it tomorrow. Just a plain statement, as if it were already settled. I stared at the words, rereading them like they might shift if I blinked slowly enough. Packed it. For what? I typed out another message. Are we moving? Then deleted it. Then typed it again. And sent it, no reply. By the next morning, the question had started to ache. Not loud, but constant. Like a bruise pressed just beneath the skin. I needed some reality check that didn't come filtered through. Marla's half smiles or Eric's silences, so I called Mrs. Lynn. She lived 2 doors down, a retired librarian with a tidy front garden and an instinct for detail. She always noticed when someone trimmed a hedge or changed a porch light. Her voice was familiar, gently curious, when she answered. I asked her if she'd seen Eric around lately. She could check on the house. There was a pause. Then she said, almost surprised, "Oh, I thought you'd left already." The movers came last week. Big truck. They were hauling boxes for hours. I didn't say anything. She filled the silence with small observations. The porch plants were gone. The curtains had been drawn shut, and she hadn't seen anyone come by since. I thanked her, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. She said something kind, something about hoping the move was smooth. I hung up before she could ask anything. Else, that was the first time it hit me. Not like a slap or a crash, but like a slow, cold bloom in the chest. The realization that something had already happened. That it had happened without me. My hands felt numb, though I wasn't sure if it was from the medication or the words. I imagined our house, empty hallways, shelves, stripped bare. The faint indentations in the carpet where furniture once stood. I imagined my blue sweater folded into a box labeled donate, or worse, trash. It was no longer about missing things. It was about being erased. Eric hadn't forgotten to tell me. He had chosen not to. That afternoon, I sat on the edge of the guest bed with the phone in my lap, feeling like I was holding the last echo of something that no longer existed. A house. A life. A version of us that was already gone. The betrayal didn't scream. It didn't shatter glass. It just settled in quietly. Like dust, it took 2 favors and 1 uncomfortable silence to get someone to drive me. Marla had been oddly unavailable that morning, gone before I woke, leaving behind a bowl of cut fruit and a note that said she'd be back by evening. I stared at the handwriting for a long time, trying to decide if the curve of the letters had always been that. Neat. A neighbor she knew through her church eventually agreed to take me. A kind woman, soft-spoken, who didn't ask questions when I said I needed to see my house. My voice cracked a little when I said my house, as if it wasn't quite true anymore. We drove in silence. My body still ached from surgery, but it was. The dull kind of pain that matched the rest of me. Outside the window, the trees blurred past like slow-moving ghosts. The road I had taken so many times before felt longer now, as if distance had multiplied behind my back. When we turned onto my street, I recognized everything and nothing all at once. The lamppost at the corner was still tilted slightly left, the mailbox across the street still crooked with rust. But our driveway was empty, clean as if swept, and the mailbox. Our mailbox had a new name printed neatly across the front in black vinyl letters I didn't recognize. I stepped out slowly, letting my feet find the ground. The grass felt the same beneath my shoes, but the air around the house felt thinner. Like it had been cleared of us. The front door was painted a different color. A muted beige instead of the deep navy we had chosen together during a rainy Sunday afternoon. I hadn't even known it had been repainted. Through the blinds I could see curtains, not ours. Ours were striped blue and white, always a little too long for the windows. These were plain and neat, drawn to the sides like a stage waiting to be set. I sat down on the curb, careful not to stretch the sutures in my side, and just watched. For a while, nothing happened. Then a couple emerged, mid-30s maybe, the woman holding a clipboard, the man with his arm around her waist. They walked through the front door like it belonged to them. He said something and she laughed, pointing toward the living room. Window, our window. I watched them walk through what used to be my hallway, not ours, mine, because Eric wasn't here. Eric hadn't even called. It had rained recently. The sidewalk was still damp in patches. A leaf clung to the side of my shoe. Its veins pressed flat and brown. Across the street, someone's dog barked twice, then fell quiet. I sat there for over an hour, maybe longer. I watched a child ride past on a scooter, watched a car pull into the driveway 2 houses down, watched the sun slip behind the rooftops like it always did. No one asked me who I was. Uff. No one came out to question the woman sitting on the edge of Compers, and the woman sitting on the edge of the curb like she'd lost something she couldn't name. Eventually, the porch light flickered on, one of those automatic ones with a motion sensor. It didn't recognize me. I don't know what I expected to feel. Rage, maybe, or devastation. But what came instead was a quiet unraveling, like standing in front of a painting you once knew well, only to realize someone had repainted it with your eyes closed. The shapes were similar, the colors familiar, but none of it was yours anymore. I checked my phone, still nothing from Eric. No missed calls, no explanations, not even a lie. I thought about walking up to the door, about knocking, about asking the new owners if they knew who had lived here before them. But I DN single quotes, because suddenly I wasn't sure if I wanted the answer. I sat a little longer, till the street began to dim and the cold settled deeper into my skin. Then I stood slower than usual, heavier, and walked back to the waiting car. I didn't say much on the drive back. A woman driving didn't ask. When we reached Marla's, I paused before going inside. The lights were on. There was soup on the stove. Everything in place. But a part of me had stayed back there, sitting on a curb in front of a house that didn't remember me. And no one had told me we'd sold it. Not even my husband. It's a strange thing, calling a lawyer you barely know to ask if your life was sold without your consent. There's no graceful way to phrase it. I kept the conversation clinical at first. I asked if he could send over a copy of the house documents just for my records. He said, of course, but there was a pause before the pleasantries resumed. A delay. Not long, but long enough to catch. He called back a few hours later. I took the call sitting on the edge of Marla's bathtub, the room lit only by the faint overhead bulb humming above me. It had become my habit, hiding in small places. He cleared his throat and said my signature was on the closing paperwork. He said it slowly, like he was still unsure if it was real. I said I'd never signed anything. Not recently, not even remotely. Another pause. Then he offered to send a scan of the page. When it arrived, I opened it on my phone. The name was mine. The shape of the signature was close, believable, but the loops were too clean, too practiced. I didn't remember writing it, not in the fog of recovery, not before. I would have remembered, at least I think I would have. That night, something in my chest shifted. Not cracked, not shattered. Just shifted like a table leg nudged slightly out of place, enough to make the whole thing wobble. I opened my bag and began pulling everything out. The usual clutter of tissues, receipts, a half-used lip balm. I dug deeper, toward the bottom zippered pocket where I always kept important things, but my passport wasn't there. I stared at the empty space, then unzipped the pocket again as if it might magically appear the second time. My fingers scraped the lining, nothing. I tried to remember the last time I'd seen it. Before the surgery, when Marla insisted on organizing my documents just for safekeeping. Hadn't thought anything of it. The knot in my stomach grew heavier. I opened my banking app, scrolled through the statements. One of the joint accounts was gone, closed. A simple line item. Another was active but had been emptied. The withdrawal marked from a location I didn't recognize. My breath didn't catch. My heart didn't race. It all felt muted, like I was underwater watching the pieces fall. But in that stillness, something solid was beginning to take shape, somewhere between anesthesia and trust. I had been erased, not loudly, not with a slam or a scream. just quietly, efficiently, like a smudge being wiped from glass. The strangest part was how calm I felt. Not safe, but quiet. The kind of quiet that comes just before a storm shifts the sky. I sat on the bed for a long time, the phone still glowing beside me, the email open to the falsified signature. I imagined Eric leaning over the kitchen counter, carefully tracing my name the way he'd once practiced his own in childhood. I imagined Marla watching, tapping her nails against a mug, saying, "It's done. It's better this way." I wasn't grieving anymore. Not the house, not the loss. I had crossed into something colder, sharper. Suspicion wasn't a shadow now. It had a spine, a name. Eric hadn't just drifted. He hadn't simply checked out. He had chosen. And choices leave trails, even if they're paved with forged ink and missing passports. I looked around the room, a framed prints of wildflowers, the lavender sachet on the pillow, Marla's version of comfort. It no longer felt temporary, felt staged. I pulled out a small notepad from my bag and began to write. Dates, names, account numbers. Details I hadn't thought to track before. I wrote slowly. Deliberately because now I knew they hadn't just packed up the house. They were packing up me, and I was still here. It started with a soft chime, one of those innocuous little sounds meant to blend into the background. A new email. Subject line. Monthly payment due, unit #472. I stared at it for a few seconds before opening. The name on the invoice was mine. The account tied to one of the cards Eric and I used together, though I hadn't seen it in months. Storage facility, $67 due. I hadn't rented a storage unit. I clicked the address. A flat building out past the industrial park, an hour from Marla's place. Rows and rows of metal doors, the kind of place you drive past without looking because nothing about it wants to be noticed. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I called a cab and wrapped a scarf around my bandages, moving slowly, carefully. Like a person trying not to disturb a wound that hasn't fully decided whether to bleed or scab. The building sat quietly behind a chain-link fence, its silence wide and indifferent. At the office, I gave my name, signed a clipboard, and was handed a key. The man didn't ask questions, just slid the paper across the counter and looked past me, like he'd already seen too many stories in cardboard and lockboxes. Unit 472 was near the back. The key stuck slightly in the lock, the metal cold against my fingers. When the door rolled open, I had to step back. The light inside was motion-triggered, flickering before it stabilized. It took a few seconds to register. What I was seeing? Boxes, stacked neatly. Some marked in thick black ink, others left blank. A few had masking tape with short, abrupt labels, kitchen linens. Books, but others were labeled differently. Donate, trash, .1. Read simply. To sort later. I walked slowly between the stacks, trailing a hand along the side of a box labeled office. Handwriting wasn't on any of them. There was my grandmother's quilt, the one with the worn blue stitching, folded too tightly inside a plastic bag. My wedding shoes, a stack of journals I thought I'd lost, their ribbon bookmarks still tucked in at halfway points. Everything felt still, airless, like time had been pressed between the lids of each box. It wasn't just the things themselves. It was the way they had been arranged, cataloged almost clinically. A life repackaged for disposal. There was a box labeled miscellaneous. I opened it carefully. Inside was my sketchbook, a cracked frame from our old hallway, a birthday card with my name smudged across the envelope. Beneath it all, a note, short, written in what looked like Marla's handwriting. Sort out before end of month. Check with Eric. I sat down on a low stool in the corner, the kind you find in garden sheds, and tried to breathe. The bandages around my side pinched with every exhale, but the pain kept me anchored. It would have been easier if it had all been thrown away. The house had burned down or the movers had lost everything. But this was intention. This was someone making decisions about what parts of me were worth keeping. I thought of Marla with her perfect kitchen, her endless trays of herbal tea. I thought of her arranging these boxes like a project. Efficient, detached, and Eric, silent, complicit. Maybe even grateful to have someone else take care of the details. I pressed my hands flat against my knees, grounding myself in the chill of the concrete. The betrayal no longer felt like a story unraveling. It felt like a ledger, but something else settled beside it. Not rage. Not quite. Something cooler. More deliberate. I began opening boxes, not to cry, not to mourn. Let's take inventory. Because if they had taken the time to sort through my life, then I would take the time to reclaim it. Piece by piece, they had labeled this space storage. But at WASN single quotes, it was proof. I chose a cafe that neither of us had any memory of. Not our Sunday spot. Not the one near the park where we used to pretend we liked jazz. Just a quiet place on a side street, all muted earth tones and the sound of spoons against ceramic. I arrived early, picked a seat in the far corner facing the entrance. Eric walked in late, not by much, just enough to make it feel calculated. Like he wanted to keep a little distance between us, even in time. He scanned the room and hesitated when he saw me. His hair was slightly longer than I remembered, or maybe I'd just forgotten how much gray had crept in. He wore the same navy coat he used to leave slung over the back of chairs. It looked newer now. He didn't greet me with a smile. Just sat down slowly, as if unsure what version of me he'd be meeting. I watched him watch me. His eyes flicked. Briefly to my side, maybe to check if I still looked fragile, still in recovery. I asked how he was. He said, fine. Asked how I'd been sleeping. I said IDIDN. Single quotes T. Then we sat there for a long moment, wrapped in the kind of silence that feels both familiar and foreign. Like slipping back into an old sweater you no longer like the feel of. He reached for the menu, but I placed a folder on the table before he could speak. Oh, a slim beige file, unmarked. He stared at it, didn't touch it. I told him it contained revisions to the family trust, notarized, filed. Legal. His mouth twitched, just slightly. He asked what I meant. I told him I'd taken myself out of it. His name, Marla's name. All of it removed from anything that still bore weight. The accounts in my name, the storage unit, the last deed I'd quietly had reassigned months before he'd noticed. I told him I figured they didn't want me in the way, so I made sure I wasn't. His face didn't flush. It's paled. All the color drained from it, like watching a window frost over. He started to say something. A defense, maybe? It's an excuse? But the words stuck, thinned out before they reached the surface. He looked down and said it had been easier this way. That line, easier this way, as if betrayal were a matter of convenience. I didn't flinch, didn't fold. For the first time, in a very long time, I didn't look away. I wanted him to see it, what it looks like when silence chooses not to yield. I sipped my tea, letting it coat the back of my throat. Earl Grey, slightly bitter. He asked if I was staying with someone. I said no. He asked if I needed anything. I said I already had what I needed. There was no drama. No raised voices. Just the sound of a porcelain cup settling gently into its saucer. Eventually, he pushed the folder slightly toward himself. Not to open it, just to acknowledge it. I let him. He paid for the tea. Out of habit, I think. A final reflex of old choreography. When we stepped outside, the sun had dipped lower. A faint orange glow stretched across the sidewalk. He looked at me like someone reaching for a version of a person they'd already written off. I told him to take care of himself. He nodded. Already. Turning away, I walked in the opposite direction. Not because I needed to, but because I could. Now I live in a smaller place. A one-bedroom with creaky floors and windows that face the morning sun. It's quiet here. Not the uneasy quiet that clings to withheld words, but the kind that settles gently into your bones. I wake up with light on my face. I fall asleep without double-checking the locks. There are no whispered conversations behind closed doors. No glances I'm meant to interpret. Just space. Just stillness. The first few nights were strange. Not bad, just unfamiliar. My body still remembered the old rhythm, the way I used to lie awake listening for Eric's footsteps. Or Marla's voice humming through thin walls, always half aware that I was on borrowed time. Here, there's no one waiting for me to disappear. I'm not in anyone's way. The walls are bare for now. I haven't unpacked everything. I've kept only what mattered: my grandmother's quilt, a few framed sketches, a chipped teacup I found at the bottom of a storage box. The rest I gave away. Not out of bitterness, but as a kind of ritual. A quiet offering to the life I no longer owed explanation to. Some afternoons I sit near the window with tea and let the sun pour in. It moves across the floor slowly, like it's learning me. I watch the shadows stretch and pull. Watch birds flicker across the sky like thoughts I don't need to catch. I keep thinking about the difference between pain and harm. Surgery leaves pain. Betrayal leaves something softer, harder to point to, a kind of ache that hides beneath politeness. Sometimes I catch myself tracing along the edges of that ache. Not the scar from the incision, but the quiet bruises of having been unseen. It doesn't sting the way it used to. Not anymore. I mailed Marla a thank you card last week. No return address, no note. Just a blank card with a watercolor painting of a bird in flight, not because I owed her thanks, but because I wanted to mark the ending with something still. Something that didn't ask for a response. I imagined her opening it, turning it over, trying to read into the emptiness. I imagined her setting it down, confused, maybe a little annoyed. But I didn't write a single word. I didn't need to. I'd already said everything by leaving by walking out of the version of myself that once waited to be invited in. Eric hasn't called. I don't expect him to. Whatever we were unraveled long before the house was emptied, before my name was erased. From things I once signed in trust. I don't miss him. Not in the way I thought I might. What I missed most was my own clarity, the sound of my voice before it quieted to accommodate his . And now? No small place. That voice is returning. Not loud, not vengeful. Steady. I talk less these days, but when I do, I mean it. Some people think healing is loud, a grand gesture, a declaration. For me, it's been softer. A drawer that closes without force. A morning where I don't brace for bad news. A single room that belongs only to me. I've left nothing behind they can still use. No open threads, no unfinished apologies, just absence. And in that absence, I've made space for quiet, for light, for a kind of peace that doesn't explain itself.